She stepped off the elevator with a hesitant grace, clutching her plain leather bag like a shield, her polished flats echoing softly on the cold marble floor. The reception area of the towering glass building loomed ahead, sleek and sterile, with a silence broken only by the tapping of keyboards and the low hum of conversation. No one greeted her, no one looked up. But she felt the eyes, they grazed her like whispers. A young black woman, skin the shade of fresh earth, in a sensible dress from a department store, walking through a space that had no scent of her kind. She paused at the front desk, offered a quiet good morning, and introduced herself. The receptionist's eyes flicked from her face to her shoes, her tone polite but flat as she asked if she was here to interview for the assistant role. She corrected her gently, saying it was her first day. The woman nodded, printed a badge, and waved vaguely toward the elevators again. No offer of a tour, no mention of HR, just a quiet assumption that she was someone minor. Someone passing through inside the open floor office. The reaction was more overt. Heads turned, conversations stalled mid-word. She could hear someone whisper "new intern" behind a row of cubicles. A man with a crisp blue shirt and a smug grin gave her a thumbs up and said welcome to the grind. Before returning to his screen, another woman holding a tablet and coffee pointed her toward a corner desk with no nameplate. The chair was lower than the others, clearly not set up. She sat anyway, unsure of what else to do, and waited. No one introduced themselves. No one asked her who she was or why she was there. She pulled out a notepad and began reviewing the company reports she'd studied for weeks, trying to drown the rising discomfort in spreadsheets and shareholder graphs. A half hour passed before someone finally addressed her directly. A tall man, mid-50s, his hair graying at the temples in a way that seemed styled rather than aged, stood at the head of the open space and called for a team huddle. Everyone shuffled over quickly, laptops still warm in their arms. She hesitated, but when he looked at her, frowning slightly, she joined them. His eyes skimmed over her. He didn't ask her name. "Could someone grab coffee for the group?" he said, scanning the team. His eyes landed on her again. "Would you mind, sweetheart?" A few people chuckled. She froze, then nodded slowly, her fingers tight around the edge of her notepad. No one corrected him. No one intervened. She moved toward the break room, back straight, face blank. Inside, she let out a slow breath and stared at the row of mugs. She wasn't angry, not yet. She was calculating, watching by the time she returned, carrying a tray of mismatched mugs with an odd sense of ceremony. The meeting had begun. Someone was discussing market growth. Charts flashed on a wall screen. She handed out the drinks one by one, not looking at their faces. When she reached the man who had made the request, he took the mug with a smirk, said thanks, and turned back to the screen. She stood there a moment longer, waiting. No one offered her a seat. She set her notepad down on the edge of the table and stood silently, listening, observing. The numbers were off. They were celebrating growth that was masking inefficiency. She saw it immediately, the kind of detail you only see when you've worked your way up through the dust of broken systems. But she said nothing. The door opened behind them, and a hush fell. A man in a tailored navy suit stepped in. Silver-rimmed glasses, steady presence, board chairman, everyone straightened. The tall man smiled, expecting praise. The chairman didn't look at him. Instead, he walked past the table and stood beside her. "Good morning," he said to the room. "I'd like to introduce you to your new chief executive officer." He gestured toward her. Silence slammed into the space like a wave. Her name echoed in the quiet. Slowly, she stepped forward, the coffee tray still in her hand. Her eyes scanned the room, calm and unreadable. She saw their confusion, their guilt, their disbelief. She didn't flinch, didn't smile. She placed the tray down on the table, adjusted the notepad, and finally spoke. The silence lingered for a beat too long. Faces shifted from blank surprise to embarrassed smiles, then quickly rearranged into polite expressions of professionalism. A few clapped, awkward and late. The man who had asked her to fetch coffee suddenly found interest in his tablet screen, the glow of it casting shadows across the flush in his cheeks. She nodded once at the chairman, then turned to the room. "Let's begin," she said simply, her voice calm but sharp at the edges, slicing through the discomfort like a scalpel. No one moved. It took a moment before people began returning to their seats. She walked to the head of the long meeting table and stood, notebook closed in front of her, posture composed. The room was watching her differently now, eyes searching her face for something warmth, weakness, approval. None was offered after the meeting. People moved around her with stiff attempts at friendliness. A younger analyst with large glasses and a nervous energy came up and stammered something about how excited he was to work with her. She thanked him coolly and asked a pointed question about Q3 projections. He stumbled over his response. She nodded and moved on. Two senior managers followed her down the hallway, offering to show her her new office. One of them, a woman in a beige suit who had earlier waved her toward the intern desk, now gestured deferentially, apologizing under her breath for the confusion earlier. She said it like she was swallowing something sour. The new CEO simply walked past her without acknowledgement, the heels of her flats clicking a new rhythm, now steady, deliberate, controlled inside the corner office. Sunlight spilled across the desk like it knew it belonged to someone different now. She placed her bag down, opened her laptop, and began typing emails, internal memos, policy drafts she had been working on for weeks, ready to implement. She had not been idle in her preparation. She knew who had backed her appointment, who had questioned it, and who had said nothing. She knew the company's fault lines, not just financial, but cultural. She'd lived in places where you had to read tone before words, where respect wasn't given freely, and where being overlooked was a weapon used against the quiet strong. She'd learned early how to speak when it mattered, and how to let silence work for her when it didn't over the course of the day. Her presence rippled through the company like a storm no one had prepared for. Department heads began scheduling meetings with her, most under the guise of welcome briefings. They arrived with stiff smiles and rehearsed pleasantries, trying to reframe their earlier dismissiveness as misunderstanding. But she remembered every glance, every offhand comment. She let them speak. She took notes. When they finished, she asked questions, the kind of questions that made people sweat. Why had their marketing costs risen 18% with no ROI? Why was middle management retention so low? Why had they continued outsourcing customer service despite the consistent drop in satisfaction metrics? Her questions weren't angry, they were surgical. She didn't need to raise her voice. The silence after each question did all the work for her. In the break room later that afternoon, a group of junior employees whispered about her. One of them, a black woman in her 20s with braids coiled into a bun, looked visibly proud, though she said nothing out loud. Another employee asked if she had seen the COCV Ivy League degrees, nonprofit leadership, 3 successful turnarounds. The first woman nodded. "Doesn't matter where she went to school," she said. "She sees things." Across the office floor, the energy had changed. People began to sit straighter when she walked by. Some of the same individuals who had ignored her that morning now stood when she entered a room, as if they had always respected her authority. She knew it was performative. She wasn't fooled. What mattered was what they would do when she wasn't in the room by late afternoon. Her calendar was full for the week, yet she noticed no one had scheduled a one with her about company culture, the elephant in the room. The fact that everyone had misjudged her, not just because she was new, but because she didn't look like what they imagined a CEO should be. No one spoke of it directly, but it hung in the air, thick and unacknowledged. Still, she said nothing. Let them wonder if she noticed. Let them wonder if she planned to address it. Her silence became its own kind of challenge, its own kind of reckoning. She was here now, and nothing was going to be the same. Not the meetings, not the metrics, And definitely not the way people treated those who walked through the door, looking like they didn't belong. The air conditioning hummed faintly above, casting a cold edge over the already tense office. She sat alone in her corner office now, the blinds half drawn, her screen reflecting the brief outlines of performance reviews and vendor contracts. There were names on those reports, names of people who had smirked at her that morning, who still hadn't grasped how deeply their assumptions had already cost them. She was methodical, quiet in her assessment, but not unfeeling. Every detail mattered. Every moment of dismissal was being remembered and catalogued, not for revenge, but for clarity. She needed to understand the foundation she had inherited before she began reshaping it. Around 2:00 p.m. She received a calendar invite from Executive Strategy, an informal planning session, supposedly to bring her up to speed. The subject line was condescending in tone, orientation overview and leadership sync. The description promised introductions, coffee, and a chance to align on culture fit. She accepted, of course. She was curious. They hadn't asked her input. They had created a session to inform her how the company worked, not to listen, not to learn from her, to instruct. She arrived at the glass-walled conference room 5 minutes early. Inside, several mid-level executives were already seated. They didn't rise when she walked in. One of them, the same man from earlier with the slicked back hair and preference for cheap jabs, nodded toward the end of the table and gestured at a spot with no laptop or notepad, just a bottle of water and a pen. "Glad you could make it," he said casually, motioning for her to sit. His tone was still off, still managing to sound like a man used to giving orders, not taking them. She took the seat offered, though she noted it silently. They didn't think she would need to lead this meeting. They thought she was here to be groomed, shaped, absorbed into their patterns. The room filled with low laughter and shallow attempts at charm. One woman leaned across the table and said she hoped the transition from nonprofit to enterprise wouldn't be too jarring. Another asked where she had summered, as though her past needed to align with their networking pedigree. Then came the worst of it. The man beside her leaned back in his chair and said, "I always tell our new hires rule number 1 is keeping the execs caffeinated. Everything else is secondary." He smiled, pointed to his empty mug, and added, "Can we put you on coffee duty for today, boss? Initiation ritual." There was a beat of silence. A few people chuckled, waiting to see her reaction. Her hand paused mid-note, pen tapping once against the page. She looked at him, expression blank, not amused, not angry. Just present, watching him stretch the joke, waiting for someone else to step in. No one did. Not a single person in the room pushed back. No one said it was inappropriate. The discomfort registered on a few faces, but they chose their silence over solidarity. She stood slowly, collecting the mug in one hand, her own untouched bottle in the other. "Sure," she said evenly. "Let me get you that coffee." Her voice was calm, cool, almost bored. She turned and left the room with the kind of poise that makes people feel uncertain. She didn't rush. She didn't slam the door. She simply walked out, mug in hand, as if it meant nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. In the break room, she poured a single cup of black coffee, placed it on a tray beside a single napkin, and returned with the slow confidence of someone who knew her position was unshakable. She didn't look at anyone as she set the mug down in front of him. No smile, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the insult. He blinked, his smirk faltering just slightly. That was enough. She turned her attention to the whiteboard where someone had scribbled company values. Synergy, ownership, respect. She stared at the last word longer than necessary when she began to speak again. Her tone had shifted. No more playing along. No more observing. She asked direct questions about recent restructuring decisions, about retention data, about why diversity recruitment remained a line item with no measurable outcomes. Her voice remained level, her questions pointed. Every person in the room felt the pressure rise, the realization creeping in that the woman they had tried to treat like an assistant was, in fact, about to reshape everything they thought they controlled. The tension was no longer in her presence, it was in their performance. In the space where arrogance had once lived, a new energy was starting to settle, uncertainty, maybe even fear. She saw it. And she let it grow. The door opened again, this time with the calm authority that didn't need to announce itself. The board chairman stepped into the room, nodding politely to the executives still seated around the conference table. The atmosphere shifted instantly, spines straightened, laptops were adjusted. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. It was a subtle panic, the kind that spreads not from guilt, but from the instinctive realization that someone important is about to say something that will rearrange the room he didn't sit. Instead, he stood behind her, placing a single page of notes on the table beside her without looking at the others. "Before we continue," he said, his voice low but commanding, "I believe a proper introduction is in order." All eyes were on him now, but a few darted quickly toward her, uncertainty already blooming in their expressions. He didn't wait for a response. "This is your new CEO. You will address her as such. Her authority is not pending or provisional. It began this morning." He paused. "Consider this meeting a formal orientation with your new leader, not the other way around." The silence was more than awkward now, it was heavy, suffocating. No one spoke. The man who had asked for coffee visibly paled, shrinking slightly in his seat as if trying to disappear into the leather. The woman who had joked about transitioning from nonprofit swallowed hard and gave a stiff nod, her earlier charm evaporating under the heat of accountability. Only the sound of a pen being nervously clicked broke the silence. She sat motionless, absorbing the moment not with smugness, but with precision. She knew what this kind of silence meant. It was the pause between denial and reckoning. She had felt it before in classrooms where teachers assumed she was underprepared, in boardrooms where her voice had been interpreted as too young, too emotional, too much. But this moment was hers now, and they all knew it. The chairman gave her a slight nod, then quietly exited the room, leaving behind the truth none of them could spin or dilute. She leaned forward, folding her hands on the table, gaze steady. No raised voice. No gloating. She didn't need to. "Let's begin again," she said simply. No apology, no explanation for her silence earlier. If they felt embarrassed, it was theirs to carry. She wasn't going to do the labor of easing them out of their discomfort. Her presence now took up space in a different way. The same executives who had ignored her that morning now leaned forward, desperate to seem involved. The man who had joked about initiation rituals tried to recover. He chuckled nervously and said, "Well, that explains your composure earlier. Had us fooled." She looked at him with a stillness that cut the room in half. "You weren't supposed to be guessing," she replied flatly. Then she moved on. The rest of the meeting unfolded with sharp contrasts. She addressed each of them in turn, not by position, but by function. She referred to performance metrics with an accuracy that made it impossible to dismiss her background. She referenced specific failures in product launches, pointed out gaps in marketing strategies, and asked them to explain recent decisions that had led to stagnation in user engagement. Her tone was even, her questions framed with data. But underneath it all, there was a challenge. Prove you belong here as much as I do. What struck them wasn't just her competence, it was the control she exhibited. She never once raised her voice, but her authority didn't need volume. It was in the way she listened, the way she paused before replying, the way she made space for accountability without saying the word. She asked one executive to pull up quarterly revenue graphs, and when he fumbled with the data, she calmly opened her own device, shared the numbers, and explained the downward trend better than the head of strategy himself. She didn't humiliate him, she simply outperformed him. Each executive responded differently to the new dynamic. Some grew defensive, offering excuses wrapped in jargon. Others shrank, avoiding eye contact, hoping the moment would pass. A few, very few, began to lean in, asking real questions, sensing the tide was turning, and that something smarter was being asked of them now still. No one mentioned how they'd treated her before the chairman walked in. No one apologized. No one admitted how easily they'd made their judgments. But that silence, too, was telling. It was the sound of systems being exposed, of patterns breaking down, and she let the silence linger, not to shame them, but to make sure they heard it for what it was. The energy in the building was different the next morning. There was a stiffness in the greetings at the front desk, a nervous edge in the way people held eye contact just a moment too long. Word had traveled quickly. The new CEO, the black woman from the rural South who'd been mistaken for an assistant, asked to fetch coffee, and overlooked in plain sight, had taken her place at the head of the company with a clarity and command that no one had anticipated. Now the people who had misjudged her were left to figure out how to unlearn the comfort of their assumptions. She moved through the office with the same unhurried pace as the day before, but now every step seemed to carry weight. Colleagues who had avoided her gaze before now offered clipped smiles and overeager greetings. Some tried too hard volunteering information she hadn't requested, offering to set up meetings she hadn't asked for, inserting themselves into hallway conversations with transparent enthusiasm. She didn't respond unkindly. She didn't need to. The shift in behavior spoke volumes. At her first department-wide meeting, she stood at the front of the room and waited for everyone to settle. No slideshow. No introductory video, just her voice firm, direct, and measured. "Let's talk about what leadership means here," she began. "Not what we say on paper, but what we actually live." There was a murmur of shifting chairs. She paused, letting the words settle. When you walk into a room, who do you notice first? Who do you interrupt? Who do you expect to serve? And who do you serve without hesitation? No one answered. She didn't expect them to. Instead, she walked them through a series of uncomfortable truths. Data on gender and race dynamics in promotions, turnover rates in underrepresented departments, the lack of mentorship structures for new employees outside of a very narrow circle. She didn't accuse, she revealed, line by line, number by number, and each line cast a new shadow on the faces around her. Some people took notes, others looked down, pretending to reread an email, but no one interrupted. The woman in beige, the one who had directed her to the intern desk just the day before, approached her afterward with a tight smile and a compliment she had clearly rehearsed. "Your presence," she said, "is already shifting the culture here." It was meant to sound like praise, but it landed hollow. She nodded politely but said nothing. She didn't need validation from the same people who had once decided she didn't belong by the end of the week. She had begun holding individual sessions with team leads. One-on-ones, no filters, no assistants taking notes, just honest conversation. Some arrived defensive, unsure how much truth was safe to tell. Others tried to impress her with numbers and buzzwords. But just a few leaned in, shared concerns they had buried for years, and asked questions not out of fear, but out of a desire to rebuild. Those were the ones she made note of, not for favoritism, for the future. At lunch, she sat in the common cafeteria instead of the executive suite, choosing a small corner table by the window. People noticed, some whispered. One junior analyst, the same young black woman who had looked proud the day before, approached her slowly and asked if she could sit. She said yes. They ate in relative quiet for a while until the young woman said, "I didn't think someone like you would ever be in charge of a place like this." She looked up from her meal, the fork paused just above her plate. "Neither did they," she said. It wasn't bitterness, it was fact. She had walked into a world that hadn't expected her, and she hadn't flinched. Instead, she had watched, waited, and then taken her rightful place, not by demanding respect, but by embodying it so thoroughly that no one could deny it anymore. The people who had dismissed her were still adjusting, still learning how to speak around their discomfort, still trying to make up for what had already been seen and known. She allowed them that process, but she wasn't going to shrink to make it easier for them. Change didn't come politely, and she had never come to be polite. She had come to lead. And now that she had arrived, the company's culture from the boardroom to the break room was going to have to catch up.